So I think it's time we started to talk about the fundamentals of photography. What's going on, guys? Mike Honeyset here, and today I want to talk to you about the 3 basics of photography that is going to help you to become a better photographer. So I know the cameras are really accessible these days, and a lot of people don't have much of an understanding of how they properly work. Or maybe you're just shooting on program mode and you want to be able to get into shooting in shutter priority, aperture priority, full manual. Hopefully this video will help you out just a little bit. Now, the inspiration for this video came from a shoot that I was recently at with multiple photographers. We were shooting some aviation things, and I could just tell from the photographer next to me that their photos were not going to come out well. And you know why? Because I've been a photographer for over 7 years. I can hear what shutter speeds sound like, and I can hear that the photographer next to me was shooting at a really low shutter speed because they were on a program mode, which was doing everything for them in the camera, which meant that their photos were going to come out blurry. Now, the 3 things I want to talk to you today, I call them the golden triangle. It's ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now, I'm going to start out with ISO because it's one of the things, and many people will disagree, but this is my opinion. It's one of the things you really shouldn't have to touch much as a photographer. Let's get into that first. So, ISO is the camera's sensitivity to light. So the more your ISO increases, the more your camera sensor is going to increase the brightness of your image to add basically artificial light. While that's great and can help increase the brightness of your photos, what's also going to happen is noise and grain in your photography. So the higher your ISO is, the more of a chance there is for your camera to add grain to your image, and it'll lose some of the quality that your image has overall. So in my opinion, ISO should always stay as close to about 100 as possible. That's the lowest setting that cameras do, and it's the least amount of grain that you're going to have. It's going to give you the crispiest photos. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule, being night photography, sunset photography, low light indoor settings where you just have to boost the ISO up. Now, in that case, only boost it up as minimum as you possibly can to achieve your desired shutter speed and aperture. The reason for that, again, is because it's going to start to add that noise and artificial grain. So let's take a look at a photo taken regularly and a photo with high ISO. I'm going to throw them up on the screen. You'll be able to see the grain difference between the two, especially when you zoom in on the photo, or if you were to print this in large format, you would see that noise. So the next thing we're going to jump into is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time your camera sensor is open to the light. So now we have mirrorless cameras that don't have the mirrors that flip up. But in DSLRs, if you look at them, you'll be able to see basically blades that go past the sensor that let light in only for a certain amount of time. Shutter speed is really easy to measure. It's all done in fractions, which equate to time. So 1/80th shutter speed is 1/80th of a second in time. 1/30th is 1/30th of a second. 1/1000th is 1/1000th of a second. So all of these correlate together, and it's how you can measure how much time light hits your camera's sensor. So there are some minimums to keep in mind with shutter speed. The first rule of thumb is anything less than 1/60th of a second, you never really want to shoot handheld. When you're shooting handheld, anything less than 1/60th of a second, regardless of the focal length your camera is at, is going to start to blur motion. So 1/60th or higher is a general rule of thumb for shutter speed in order to get crispy photos. As a beginner photographer, I would recommend even starting at 1/80th or higher so that you don't risk that. The next thing to know is to do with the kind of lens you're using. So if you're using a mirrorless or a DSLR where you can interchange lenses, keep this in mind. Your shutter speed, as a general rule of thumb, should always be double what your focal length is. So obviously that's hard to remember when you're using variable zoom lenses, like I have a 150 to 600, so I have to change that shutter speed in between there all the time. However, things that are easy to remember are when you're using portrait lenses, prime lenses. So if I'm using a 50mm lens, my shutter speed should be at minimum 1/100th of a second. And the reason for that is when you're zoomed in, your camera picks up on the little subtle shakes that your body does even more. So if I'm shooting on a 600mm lens, which I can see very, very far away, basically almost a mile. But if I'm shooting on that, I want to be at least at 1/1200th of a second in order to not have any kind of camera shake in there. So the next thing I want to talk about is aperture. Aperture controls the amount of light your lens lets to hit your sensor. So that, along with shutter speed, If your aperture is a large aperture, f4, and it's wide open like that, it's letting more light in to then hit your shutter, which will open and close, that hits your sensor on your camera. One thing to remember with aperture is it also controls your depth of field. So if you've ever seen photos that are really, really crispy and everything's in focus, you are generally shooting with a very small aperture, which is a large number, but it's letting less light into the camera. That's creating a very deep depth of field. If you see photos like portraits, or if you see photos that are really shallow depth of field, macro photography maybe, plants, things like that, where everything in the background is blurred and only the subject is in focus, that's using a short depth of field or a very wide open aperture, which is the smallest aperture number possible. Now I know that that's really confusing because it's backwards. If you're using a large aperture, your opening is smaller. If you're using a small aperture, your opening is larger. They're reversed. Let me show you on an old film lens that I have, because it's able to show you the best way, and the aperture for this is actually manual on the lens. So right here is the largest aperture I can do. This is f4. It's letting the most amount of light in, which you can see is all the way there. If I start to close down the opening or create a larger aperture, you can see this little pinhole start to come through. That pinhole is letting less light in to the camera to hit the sensor, but it's also creating a deeper depth of field. So that's a good way to remember it. Aperture is basically a little set of blades that let you control the amount of light that's coming into the camera. Now, the important thing to remember is that what you do to one, you basically have to do to the other. So if you are shooting at a very high shutter speed, typically to compensate for your camera, you are going to have a very open aperture, low aperture number to let more light in. If you're shooting at a low shutter speed, your aperture is going to be more closed or a higher number in order to let less light in so that it kind of counteracts each other. So one way to counteract this is to use neutral density filters. Neutral density filters are basically sunglasses for your camera. They go onto your lens and they basically take light away from your image so that you can have a lower shutter speed, a more wide open aperture so that you can control more things on your camera. What that does is for things like longer exposures, if you're trying to get the blur in a waterfall, things like that, you're able to add neutral density filters to let less light in. That's going to be in another video that we dive into that though, because we're just talking about the main three on here. So you're starting to understand aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Let's dive into different camera modes that you can use to help you learn this even more. So on most cameras these days, DSLRs, mirrorless, so like my Sony, you have shutter priority and aperture priority modes that you can use. So let's get out of program mode where everything is automatic on the camera. Let's get out of that. Let's shift to aperture priority, which on most cameras, DSLRs will show as AV or just A on a Sony. So aperture priority, what's going to happen is you as the photographer control the aperture of your camera. You change that f-stop to let more light or less light or control the depth of field of the camera. So you're doing that, the camera is compensating by setting your shutter speed for you. This is probably one of the best ways to learn depth of field because your camera, unless you're in a darker setting or you're shooting at f22, your camera will typically not go into a lower shutter speed, so you can get some really nice photos while you kind of dabble in creating a depth of field or a more artistic look. The other priority you can shoot in is shutter priority. It shows as TV, or on Sony mirrorless it shows S. But shutter priority mode is where you control the shutter speed and the camera then controls the aperture for you. This can be a little more negative because you're not controlling the depth of field of your photos at this point. So your camera is setting that for you. You don't have control. When you go into edit, there's nothing you can do if something you wanted in focus is out of focus. So that's the one warning I have on shutter speed. However, there are some creative things you can do with shutter speed priority, like what I do with aviation, that can benefit you. So when I'm shooting aviation photos on shutter priority, I am using probably 300th of a second in order to get the blur of rotors or propellers on a plane. That way you can see that something is in motion. Shutter speed is a really good way to get those kind of artistic details and not have to worry about your aperture, where your camera will set that for you, because typically if I'm shooting in highlight situations, I'm gonna have a realistic aperture based off of my shutter speed anyway. The next mode you can go into is manual. In manual mode, you're setting both the shutter speed and the aperture, so you need to learn how those two work together and kind of figure out how your camera reacts to light. So basically you can experiment by changing one. Your monitor in your camera will show your highlights, or like for me, when I'm shooting on my Sony, I use what are called zebras, which show you the highlighted areas. You'll be able to see where your high points and your low points are in your image, but we'll dive into manual mode on another video. Now I know this was fast. I know it's the quick and dirty of the 3 fundamentals for cameras. However, we are gonna keep going with this series. We're gonna do fundamentals of videography, fundamentals of sports photography, fundamentals of aviation photography, and we'll dive even more into how you can manipulate your camera settings into getting the best images for you. However, I hope that this video did help you at least learn something with your camera to get off of maybe program mode, or maybe understand how shutter speed and aperture work just a little bit more. And if you did enjoy the video, I really hope you like it and subscribe to our channel so we can help you out with more photography tips in the future.